Portland City Council has been holding off on expanding a response team dedicated to helping people having a mental health crisis. Now, one commissioner says we've waited long enough.
There's not a corner of Portland that doesn't want Portland Street Response, so we're rolling it out.
Okay, but when would we be able to actually call them? And the former coach of the Portland Thorns has been fired after an investigation found he abused players.
There have been a couple of players who have just gone through some really traumatic stuff, and our club didn't protect them.
Here's the story.
And I'm Dan Haggerty. Thank you for being with us. It is a Monday. Let's get the week started. A lot of important things to talk about. We want to hear from you. Give us your opinions. Tell me what you think. What do you think about the stories that we're covering? What do you think about the way that we're covering them? Please email us at thestory@kgw.com. You can also find us on Instagram and Facebook. Those are working again today, right? Well, I know Twitter hasn't been down at all. Don't forget to use the hashtag #HeyDan. Let's get started. Now, the big story tonight is about you looking for help. What do you do when you need help? Well, you call police, you call 911. And for every part of the city, that's who you're going to get. You're going to get police, except for one, you have a second option, Portland Street Response. All right, they are in North Portland. But there is another conversation now on what to do for the rest of the city. For instance, should that fight be taken citywide? And it's gearing up once again. Here's Maggie Vespa.
I don't know how to live like you.
Amid Portland's historic housing crisis, one that's forced us to get used to tragedy playing out in public.
We had somebody die on the streets.
The push to expand an innovative program trumpeted as a solution is ramping up again.
We've heard all over the city that every community wants Portland Street Response.
Commissioner Jo Ann Hardesty unveiled her pitch Monday. She wants to take Portland Street Response citywide by spring, and she's hoping momentum builds fast.
Do you think this will pass?
Well, you have to ask my colleagues about that.
We'll get to the politics in a minute. First, a refresher on Portland Street Response, or PSR. In the wake of the racial justice protests of 2020, the City Council launched PSR as a policing alternative. The promise to take officers out of the equation on calls involving mental health and addiction, and instead send a crisis counselor and a paramedic.
Our goal is to lessen the disproportionate criminal justice treatment of the city's homeless population.
Teams hit the ground running in February 2021, but the council wanted to start small, dubbing PSR a pilot project and limiting it largely to Southeast Portland's Lentz neighborhood. The goal, to go citywide after roughly a year. But some commissioners, including Mayor Ted Wheeler, refused to guarantee that funding, opting instead to wait and see the data. Public blowback was swift. Even Oregon Senator Ron Wyden and Congressman Earl Blumenauer tweeted their frustration, Blumenauer urging the council to fully fund the program. Hardesty was fed up then, and she's fed up now. Heading into the fall budget adjustment later this month, she plans to push her fellow commissioners to guarantee spending just over $1 million, enough to hire and train 13 full-time staffers and expand PSR citywide. That expansion would kick in March 2022 with teams on the ground 7 days a week. Hardesty says it's time.
I mean, when was the last time our congressional delegation, business community, grassroots community, houseless advocates all were saying the same thing? What's wrong? What do you mean you're not expanding Portland Street Response, right? The community is demanding it.
Okay, Maggie Vespa joining us now. So we know how Jo Ann Hardesty feels about this. Yeah. What about the rest of the commissioners?
Yeah, so we reached out to every single sitting city commissioner, and basically it sounds like this is going to be a go. Dan Ryan, Mingus Mapps, Carmen Rubio, all of them saying they will support this expansion. The only person who's on the fence right now is Mayor Ted Wheeler. He says he supports the program, but he's just kind of reviewing this proposal at the moment. So we'll see.
All right, what happens if this is a go? Are we talking about March or so? People citywide would be able to call and potentially get the street response team.
Right. If everybody votes as they say they will, at this point, this would be a go. And then come March, you could call 911 and get Portland Street Response to that call if 911 operators deem it appropriate, meaning there's nobody with a weapon or an imminent threat to your safety. We should point out it would not be 24/7. It would basically be during the day on weekdays and at night on weekends. And that's based on data collected by researchers at Portland State University who have been following Portland Street Response and the calls they get. That data, it is worth noting, could be the one thing that kind of holds this up or throws any curveballs at the city council. Again, that has been collected by PSU. It's going to be presented for the first time at a work session for city council tomorrow mornings. We will, of course, be watching that.
Absolutely. Maggie, thank you.
Sure.
Portland has been looking for an alternative to police for mental health and homeless issues for a while now. So how did we get here? Eugene has had a program like this for decades. It's called CAHOOTS, which stands for Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets. They started actually by running first aid tents at Grateful Dead shows in the 1970s and 80s. And for the past 30 years, they've worked alongside Eugene police. Instead of officers, CAHOOTS sends teams of EMTs and crisis counselors to calls involving addiction or mental health crises. In 2013, the U.S. Department of Justice found that Portland police had a pattern of using excessive force against people suffering from mental illness. So the Bureau started training all of its officers in crisis intervention. But that wasn't enough for some groups, who pointed out that police were frequently sent out to non-violent calls involving homeless people. In 2019, Street Roots pitched the idea of having response teams field these calls instead of police. Commissioner Jo Ann Hardesty signed on to the proposal and got funding for a pilot program that was scheduled to launch in spring 2020. But it kept getting pushed back, first to fall of 2020 and then to February 2021 after COVID and other issues delayed the hiring process. And that's how we got here.
Now, let's stay on this topic for just a minute, because I know this next story is going to get some opinions from a lot of you. We talked to a business owner the other day in Portland who's up in Slabtown, owns a doggy daycare business. This person called police because a homeless man was threatening people outside of his business and even grabbed an employee at one point. Here's what he said happened.
I saw an individual that clearly seemed pretty upset and disturbed and was very threatening. Even at one point put his hand on our employee's hand. So it was a very scary, traumatic experience for our employee and even our customer. We had a few customers that were coming in to check their dogs in.
So they went inside, they locked the door, they got on the phone, they called 911, they called police. And how long do you think it took for somebody to show up, for an officer to arrive? 20 minutes? Was it 30 minutes later? 45? How long do you think?
An hour later, no one showed up.
It took an hour and 45 minutes total, almost 2 hours for somebody to get there. Why? Well, if you watch the show, you already know what police will say. They'll say they don't have the resources. This happened on a Thursday morning, and police don't have enough to respond on a Thursday morning in the middle of the city. Surprisingly, under the circumstances, the business owner seemed understanding when the officer finally pulled up.
I made it clear. I was like, hey, just want to first tell you I'm not upset with you, but I'm upset. And he knew it right away. He's like, I totally understand your frustration.
Who wouldn't? Who wouldn't? Everybody understands the frustration. We can all put ourselves in that person's shoes, what that would be like. But what are we supposed to make of this? And what can be done about it? Let's bring in Tim Gordon. He covered the story for us today. Tim, what did police tell you about this hour and 45-minute wait?
All right, well, Dan, I just got a response in just the last half hour or so from a police lieutenant who actually looked into this, talked to BOEC, the group that, calls out the 911 operators. And he says this was set as a priority 4 call. Well, priority 1 and 3 is the highest priority. So this didn't quite make that. He thinks that maybe it could have, if maybe some more information had been relayed, maybe some wires were crossed, not really sure, maybe some confusion there. And so if it had been rated a little bit higher priority, might have gotten an officer there a little sooner. He also says that despite the fact that it was Thursday morning, and you wouldn't think they wouldn't be so busy, they did have some pretty high priority calls, including some calls with weapons that slowed officers down to get to this call. That said, no, they're not satisfied with an hour and 45 minutes. We know that they're understaffed. We know they've lost 150 officers in the last year, and that's the message that we hear a lot from police about these response times. But this, an hour and 45 minutes, just way too long. And he's not trying to throw BOEC under the bus, the 911 operators, but maybe there was some confusion there about the way this priority call went out. And that may have helped at least make this a little bit longer wait. An hour, 45 minutes, just crazy.
Now, this is an extreme example. This is the first time I think we've talked about an hour and almost 2 hour wait for police to arrive. But these types of situations have been in the news cycle for a while now. What am I supposed to make of this as a regular average Joe citizen when it's starting to feel like I cannot rely on a call to 911 to do what I've always expected it to do, and that's to get somebody out to help me quickly?
Yeah, I think it's the reality of the times that we're living in. I mean, unless you've got a life or death weapons involved situation, you may not get a immediate response. It may be 15 minutes, it may be 20, but an hour and 45 minutes is just crazy, and that's why we're talking about it today. But yeah, I think it's the reality. I think that people have to kind of rethink what to expect at this point, at least for now, in Portland and other cities that are strapped this way. But Dan, I think the other thing we need to look at is how these calls are responded to. We talk about the Portland Street Response pilot program in Lents, and if that's expanded, maybe this call may have qualified for something like that. Although with the threats going on, you would think officers would also want to be included in a call like that. The safety villages, our business owner that we talked to, who is not frustrated with police, but certainly very frustrated with the situation, actually said, why not? Maybe we've got so many homeless people living in this area of troubled people, which is the root of the problem here. What if that was sanctioned and there was a homeless village there in his place where these people are getting services? Maybe these kind of things wouldn't happen as often.
Got it. All right. Tim Gordon, appreciate the report, sir.
You bet. Thanks, Dan.
Now, let's pivot for a moment and talk about something called institutional betrayal. It's when an institution, say your workplace, for instance, lets you down or hurts you because of their own systemic failures. Former Portland Thorns player Sinead Farley says that she learned the term because of what happened to her while she was playing for former coach Paul Riley. This all stems from a huge investigative piece in The Athletic, which we think is worth your time. It details years of abuse that players say Coach Riley inflicted on them, both when he was a coach for the Thorns and for several years beforehand. Paul Riley coached the Thorns from 2013 until he was fired in 2015. Several players, including Farley, say Riley abused his power during that time. Farley says that the Coach Riley, coerced her and another teammate into having sex with him, and that he forced her and a teammate, Mana Shim, to kiss each other. They both say that he made disparaging comments about their weight or their sexual orientation, that he sent pictures of himself in his underwear to them, that he got players drunk and invited them alone to his hotel rooms. The players say they felt like they had no choice but to put up with this behavior, that Riley was their boss and he had the power to make or break their careers. In the article, one former Thorns player is quoted saying, quote, "It's almost like an abusive relationship. Even when it's not crossing the line of sexual because he gives and takes, the girls just want to please their coaches. They want to do the right thing. Paul said he'll invest in you, and then he takes it away." The players say even when they tried to report the things that Riley was doing, the National Women's Soccer League didn't provide them with a lot of options. They say at the time there was nothing in the players' handbook about protections for players, and there was no way to anonymously report any wrongdoing. Finally, the NWSL investigated, and they said that Riley didn't do anything illegal, but they did let him go from the team anyway for, quote, violating policies. But they didn't say which policies he had violated. They kept all of the details of that investigation private, and before long, Riley was hired somewhere else, by the New York Flash and then by the North Carolina Courage. Paul Riley has denied all of these claims against him, but he was fired from the North Carolina Courage last week and lost his coaching license. The head of the National Women's Soccer League, Lisa Baird, is also fired over this. Soccer games were canceled last week and a rally was held here in Portland to support the players. We talked to the chair of the Rose City Riveters about all of it.
We really want to make sure that the players are being centered right now. They need the support. What they're going through is extremely difficult. They're fighting with their bosses and people who have an extraordinary amount of power over them. And we want to make sure that the players feel that they have our support. Number one. Number two, we want to make sure that the administration, leadership of the club knows that we're paying attention. This isn't something that we're going to let up on, and we're going to be looking to hold them accountable for whatever it is the players are asking for and changes within their own organization.
The owner of the Thorns, Merrick Paulson, published an open letter today apologizing for not making the details of the investigation public. He apologized specifically to the players who were involved. He says they're working on changes to allow players to report things anonymously and to renew their commitment to the league's anti-harassment policy. Now, it's important to note that this is not an isolated incident within the NWSL. Players across the league say that they've been dealing with substandard pay, bad facilities, racist and sexist comments from their coaches, along with verbal and emotional abuse. Coaches and managers from other teams have lost their jobs in the last few months after allegations of wrongdoing. In March, 240 players signed a letter to the NWSL commissioner asking them to ensure safe and inclusive workplaces. The director of the Players Association says that this is, quote, the beginning of a reckoning.
Time to say so long to Roosevelt and Lincoln. Portland's presidential statues are probably not coming back. But the mayor of a nearby city says, oh, we'll take them. And the Mexican restaurant keeping their menu a little more authentic.
Right off the bat, you're not going to find chips and salsa. You're not going to find, guacamole or margaritas.
When the story continues.
Welcome back. I always go through your questions and comments during the break. Please keep sending them to the story at kgw.com or use the hashtag HeyDan on Twitter. I also want to remind you about our Hey Help campaign this week. We're asking you to please consider donating to Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women USA. They're an Oregon-based organization, and your donations will help them to spread the word about missing Native women and to pay for the basic supplies and needs of the families who lose a loved one. If you want to help them out, they could certainly use your help. Just hold the camera on your phone to the QR code on the screen. It'll take you to a donation page. You can also go to kgw.com/heyhelp. And this is a micro donation drive, so please feel free to give any amount that you can provide, no matter how small. It all helps. Now let's get to a viewer question, shall we? I got this one from Jim. Jim asked, what is the status on the Abraham Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt statues? When does the city plan on returning them? So quick little background here, just in case you forgot. Protesters tore down the Lincoln and Roosevelt statues in the park blocks last October during a demonstration on Columbus Day called Indigenous Peoples Day of Rage. A statue of George Washington at Northeast 57th and Sandy was also torn down during the George Floyd protests in June of 2020. So last week, the Regional Arts and Culture Council, they met to talk about these statues and some of the other ones that were toppled during last year's protests. And they recommended that the presidential statues should not be returned to their original locations, but they still want to keep them in the city's collection of art. So we'll see what the city eventually decides to do with that recommendation. I should note that the Portland City Council has said it wants some new art for the park blocks that represent more diverse cultural identities. And the George Washington statue apparently can't be returned to its original location because that original location is private property and the owners apparently don't want it anymore. Someone who does want it is this person, the mayor of Sandy, Stan Pulliam, who happens to be running for governor, I might add. In July, he announced that he wanted to put the statues of the presidents in Sandy, calling them symbols of virtue and American exceptionalism. But according to Willamette Week, Portland responded by basically saying, get in line. Apparently, several other groups have asked for the statues too, including the Freemasons. So we'll keep you updated on what happens with the statues and where they, I guess, eventually end up. Now, it is dinner time. I'm wondering if you're hungry. I'm always hungry at this exact part of the show. Right now, it is Hispanic Heritage Month, and a restaurant in Portland wants to share Mexican culture and history through their food. But for them, that means kind of getting away from the chips and salsa and giant burritos and Taco Tuesday that you might be used to from Mexican restaurants here in the U.S. John Goodwin tells us about this chef's inspiration.
It's kind of like the fusion of the clash of two empires and the fusion of two cultures.
Tucked away in the Pearl District, you'll find the Mexico Forward restaurant República. It's been open since last October.
We don't want it to be like a typical Mexican restaurant you would find in the United States or some places. Nothing wrong with those businesses, but we didn't want to be that.
Executive Chef Lauro Romero co-owns the restaurant. So does Angel Medina. Here, you don't just find a meal, you get an experience.
Right off the bat, you're not going to find chips and salsa. You're not going to find, guacamole or margaritas. It's not that we don't like those things. Those things have a place. They just don't have a place here, mostly because you just don't need them.
I wanted to continue to learn about, the culture and the food, and as well as to share that knowledge through our dishes and the stories that we tell.
This month is Hispanic Heritage Month, and República focuses on the history and heritage of the dishes. Think of it as traditional home-style Mexican food.
More about the presentation and giving you something that you would find in somebody's house. You're going to find a quesadilla oaxaqueña done in the same style as Oaxaca. You're going to find tacotes done in the style of Jalisco, and pozole the way that our chef likes to make it, from where he's from.
The concept consists of a daytime menu for breakfast and brunch with an evening 5-course chef's tasting menu. For many, Angel says it might not be what you're used to, but come with an open mind.
We're going to focus on giving you quality, focusing more on the stories and on sharing with you something that you never knew about this particular dish that you thought you knew. And because of it, it's made all the difference. I think that's the bonus, not just for us telling the story, but the people that are actually, partaking in this experience entirely.
In downtown Portland, John Goodwin, KGW News.
Well, if you weren't hungry before, you're hungry now. My stomach's literally growling, but we're almost done. The show's almost over, so you can stop focusing on this and maybe start eating. And then again, you could do both at the same time. There's no rule against that. Maybe for me, I can't eat. You get the point. Let's keep this thing going. Just after the break, I'll read a couple of comments and address them then. In the meantime, I'll see you as we finish the story. Let's get to some questions here. Gary writing in and saying, hey, Dan, street response seems like a good idea until a person with mental illness confronts the unarmed staff with lethal weapons. So we've discussed this before, and that's part of the entire training process, not just with the street response team, but with the 911 dispatchers who are figuring out who to send to a certain call. And if there's ever anything that indicates any threatening behavior or danger or a weapon or anything like that, they're not going to send street response. They're going to send actual officers. Of course, that doesn't guarantee people's safety. Response work like this, any type of response work, has a certain level of danger. The people going out and doing this work are doing dangerous work. I mean, there's no way around that. But again, this is something that they have done in the Cahoots program in Eugene for decades. So this isn't brand new. This isn't coming out of nowhere. There are some blueprints on how this can be done successfully, keeping people safe. Dan wrote in and said, calls to the street response should be a different number than 911. Again, with these other blueprints, this seems to be the best method. And it's because you don't want people at home trying to figure out, well, is this a street response call or is this a police call? They want the people at home to be able to call for help. It's up to the 911 operator to then listen to what that person has to say, get the pertinent information, and then send the right people. And lastly, John said, hey, Dan, we need to quit whining about all this crap and just hire more police, train them better, so on and so forth. It's a very difficult thing to do. It's very hard to hire police officers. It's very dangerous work. It's heavily scrutinized work. Morale is pretty much down across the country. And even before the pandemic, George Floyd, all of the things that have happened in this city and across the country, in Portland, we were already dealing with difficulties hiring quality officers. So again, all good questions. I think maybe all of these topics are worth looking into again and again and again, honestly. But keep the questions coming. I'm Dan Haggerty. Thanks for being with us on a Monday. We'll see you back here tomorrow for the story.